Post-workout recovery. This breath sequence is designed to speed up recovery time after a workout by regulating the autonomic nervous system and increasing parasympathetic tone to help increase cardiorespiratory recovery and improve circulation. These exercises are centered on maintaining slow breath with intermittent retention to build up CO2 and nitric oxide that increases cellular oxygenation and aids in muscle recovery. One of the most powerful aspects of the breath when it comes to recovery is its ability to suppress the sympathetic nervous system and stimulate the parasympathetic response. The parasympathetic nervous system is classically coined the rest and digest, or rest and recover system. It is responsible for slowing our heart rate and respiratory rate, opening our blood vessels to increase blood flow, and lowering blood pressure to recover the spent energy used while in a sympathetic state. When we do any type of physical activity, whether it's jumping off the couch to answer the door or running a marathon, our bodies need energy to move. Obviously, the amount of energy required to run to the door is much less than that for a marathon. Also, the body uses different systems to create energy for these activities. The energy to power muscles and cells comes in the form of adenosine triphosphate, or ATP, which is universal fuel for the body. As the body consumes ATP, the molecule loses one phosphate group and releases energy for us to use. ATP becomes adenosine diphosphate, ADP, which has two phosphate groups instead of three. For ADP to release more energy, it needs to regain its missing phosphate group and transform back into ATP. We've already discussed how ATP is made through cellular respiration, the process of aerobic glycolysis, or the action of converting glucose to ATP using oxygen. Aerobic means with oxygen, and glycolysis is the process of breaking down sugars using enzymes. When we are at rest, the amount of oxygen we need is equal to the amount of oxygen supplied. This is our steady state, or oxygen homeostasis. As soon as we increase our activity level, exceeding our steady state, we require more ATP and oxygen to meet this demand. ATP is readily available, but oxygen supply is not. It takes a short time for the sympathetic nervous system to respond and increase the heart and respiratory rates to meet our oxygen needs. This lack of readily available oxygen places us in a state of oxygen deficiency. Luckily, the body has 3 ways of creating energy, and 2 of those don't require oxygen to produce ATP. As soon as we move into an oxygen deficit state, the body starts producing energy anaerobically, meaning without oxygen. The first way the body does this is via the alactase, without lactic acid, system, sometimes referred to as the ATP-PC system, because phosphate and creatine, or phosphocreatine, are required to generate ATP. Our muscles readily store phosphocreatines to be immediately converted into energy during intense physical activities. These stores of phosphocreatine quickly run out after 8 to 12 seconds, releasing energy and heat as a byproduct. It takes the body anywhere from 30 seconds to 2 minutes to restore the alactase system so we can use it again. After this first system is exhausted, the body switches to lactic acid system for the bulk of its immediate energy needs. The lactic acid system converts stored sugars, glycogen, to energy without oxygen through a process called anaerobic glycolysis, using several complex chemical reactions. The glycogen breaks down into ATP, hydrogen ions, pyruvic acid. We can sustain anaerobic activity for approximately 30 seconds to 3 minutes while our oxygen supply builds up to meet our oxygen demand. Pyruvic acid and hydrogen ions increase the acidity levels in the muscles, leading to muscle fatigue. When oxygen is available, the pyruvic acid is converted to energy via the citric acid cycle, also known as the Krebs cycle. If there is not sufficient oxygen available, then pyruvic acid goes through a process called fermentation and produces lactic acid. However, lactic acid is no longer thought to lead to delayed onset muscle soreness, and it is mostly believed to be caused by tiny tears in the muscles from eccentric contractions, or increased tension on the total length of the muscle. Our anaerobic systems are not resistant to fatigue and wear out quickly. Once our oxygen supply increases to meet demand, the body switches to aerobic glycolysis. If we can't raise oxygen supply to reach our oxygen deficit quickly enough because our VO2 max is insufficient, then we won't be able to sustain aerobic activity and we will experience exhaustion. As soon as we can meet the demand for oxygen, the aerobic system becomes our primary source for creating energy by converting sugars and oxygen to ATP and releasing carbon dioxide and water. We should be familiar with this third system of aerobic glycolysis by now, since it is the main action of cellular respiration and why we breathe. Aerobic glycolysis runs primarily off of our glycogen or sugar stores, but once those are used up, the body switches to burning fat. It usually takes about 2 hours to use up our sugar stores, but once we do, fatigue begins to set in. Converting fat to energy requires a lot more oxygen than sugar and is much more work for the body and cardiorespiratory system. This fatigue is commonly known as hitting a wall. Recovering our glycogen stores takes 24 to 48 hours. The more we train and exercise, the more quickly we are able to meet our aerobic homeostasis, or the state where the oxygen supply meets oxygen demand. We're able to reach this state more quickly because we can increase our heart rate and breathe faster, decreasing the amount of time spent in the anaerobic phase, which means less oxygen deficiency and faster recovery. After exercising, we move into the final phase, which is often referred to as the afterburn effect, but is more accurately termed excess post-exercise oxygen consumption, EPOC. For up to several hours after any strenuous activity, the body continues to use more oxygen than usual, or continuation of increased consumption of oxygen, which is the beginning of recovery phase. During EPOC, we want to continue to burn between 6 and 15% of the amount of energy we used during exercise. As we start resting, our bodies are still carrying out many of the functions that were active during exercise. Even though we have finished our workout, our sympathetic nervous system remains dominant and we continue to have elevated levels of epinephrine, adrenaline, and norepinephrine. Our metabolic rate is still increased and we require more oxygen. Our heart rate and respiratory rate have not returned to normal and our bodies need to continue using energy to replace the phosphocreatine store and remove any excess lactic acid. EPOC can last for 1 hour to several hours post-exercise, and while we are in this phase, it is vital to increase our oxygen to speed up recovery time. Once we finish exercising and begin the recovery process, we want to quickly shift our autonomic nervous system to stimulate our parasympathetic nervous system. The activation of the parasympathetic nervous system slows heart rate, opens blood vessels to increase blood flow, and lowers our adrenaline levels. We can increase the uptake of oxygen into the cells, which will also help decrease lactic acid and increase energy production from pyruvic acid by elevating our CO2 levels with breath retention. We also want to increase our nitric oxide levels. Nitric oxide helps decrease the inflammatory response, speeds up cellular regeneration, aids in repairing muscle fibers, as well as increases blood flow to remove waste byproducts from exercise and increase cellular oxygenation. Begin this post-workout recovery sequence in a comfortable seated posture, adhering to all the guidelines for good breathing postures, or practice in a reclined recovery position. I recommend that you lie on your back next to a wall, elevate your hips slightly on a small pad or bolster, and extend your legs up the wall or place your feet against the wall with the knees wide and slightly bent. This position can help reduce stress and fatigue, and it is a great posture that facilitates venous return from the lower extremities and increases circulation. Warm-up. The warm-up starts a little differently compared to most of the warm-up practices in this book. You begin faster than you would for most recovery practices with Bhastrika Pranayama. Normally, the Bhastrika practice would be in the heat-building component. Considering that you are starting this practice right after a workout, you are already high and in your sympathetic tone. Of course, this practice also could have started with a gentler breath technique, especially if the intention isn't to do the sequence immediately after a workout. This warm-up intends to gradually bring your energy levels down by adding in breath retention. After exercise, breath retention can be extra challenging due to an already increased heart rate and respiratory rate as well as EPOC. Beginning this practice with Bhastrika can create a small carbon dioxide deficiency, making the initial breath retention slightly more comfortable to hold. However, the rounds of Bhastrika are kept relatively low so as not to create too much carbon dioxide deficiency in relation to the duration of the breath hold. Ultimately, like any proper warm-up, this helps prepare you for the rest of the practice. The warm-up begins with 10 seconds of Bhastrika, followed by an outer retention hold for 15 seconds directly into an inner retention hold for 30 seconds. Repeat this breath practice 5 times. The beginning retentions should not be challenging. If the practice feels too difficult, allow a little more time for your heart rate to lower from your workout or shorten the retention. Heat building. The heat building component works into a slower breath practice with the focus on the outer retention. The breathing slows down to about 3 breaths per minute, with half of the respiratory time occurring on the outer retention. The inhales and exhales should only be as deep as necessary to achieve the length of the respiration. The calmer the breath, the easier it is to make the switch back to the parasympathetic nervous system. The longer outer holds will quickly build up carbon dioxide levels and facilitate expansion of the blood vessels, the increase in blood flow, and higher oxygen cellular perfusion. The parasympathetic nervous system will start to slow the heart rate and move the body into a recovery state. This breath practice consists of a 5-second inhale, a 5-second exhale, and a 10-second outer retention. Repeat this breath about 15 times or for about 5 minutes. Vitalizing. The vitalizing component is a slow build from the heat building component. The primary intent is to increase parasympathetic tone and build up CO2, which is relatively easy to do with the breath and can be carried out in several ways. The main approaches are through slowing the respiratory rate and lengthening the breath retentions. With this practice, you don't focus too much on long holds. It's better to use shorter retentions so you can maintain a sustained, slow breathing practice without feeling the urge to catch your breath. It is common to overbreathe during physical exercise. You want to reestablish a slower breathing pattern as you move into recovery. This breath practice alternates between inner and outer retentions. You get more benefit from outer retention. However, it is more difficult to do. Switching between inner and outer retentions allows for intermittent rest without compromising the breathing rate or carbon dioxide retention. Maintain the 5-second inhale and exhale duration and alternate between one breath with a 20-second inner retention and the next breath with a 15-second outer retention. This brings the heart rate down to about 2 breaths per minute. Maintain this breath pattern for about 10 cycles or approximately 5 minutes. Cool down. The cool down uses a descending Samavitri breath with Bharami during the exhalation. Energetically, the goal is to finish the practice in a calm and balanced state. Samavitri is an excellent exercise for regulating the autonomic nervous system. The practice begins with a 15-second inhale followed by a 15-second exhale with the humming Bharami breath to increase nitric oxide levels. With each breath, decrease the ratio by 1:1 until you reach a breath ratio of 5:5. As the breath duration becomes shorter, also work to soften the intensity and depth of each breath so that you finish in a rested and rejuvenated state.